What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel and to another one of those one thing about every team videos. Today's episode is going to feature one mistake made by every Overwatch League team throughout their entire history up until the end of Season 3. No stuff that happened this offseason though, or in Season 4. So for the actual criteria, there's not much to it. The mistakes that happen could be pretty much anything. From poor management and bad trades to terrible in-game play. Some teams made more terrible decisions than others, so it goes without saying that there's a bunch of teams on here where there's definitely more than one right answer. There might be something that you have that's completely different from what I have, and that's totally fine. In fact, I encourage you to leave your own opinions down in the comment section to continue this conversation. But that's basically everything you need to know, so without wasting any more time, let's get started. The Atlanta Reign. Okay, so we're starting off with a tougher one. The Reign have made all sorts of mistakes, especially over the span of 2020, some of which I probably don't even know about. For me personally though, I would have to go with their lack of changes with their coaching roles as well as some of the general decisions they made concerning it. Think about all of the mishaps with their coaching. They struggle all year long with consistency in 2020, but no coaching changes whatsoever still happen, and in 2019 there was much of the same. Go back to Season 2. Yeah, we all remember Atlanta for their amazing 7-0 stage, plus that win over the Shock in the playoffs, but that's all they really did. Everything else was up and down the entire season, and it only seemed to get worse in Season 3 with the lack of success they found against teams with good records. Sephi is not it, and yet he gets to stick around for yet another year from the looks of it. It's ridiculous. And how about parting ways with Casores? What a missed opportunity. He started off as a developmental coach and analyst, but was let go of at the end of Season 2. Despite all of his amazing work on Team Netherlands and his reputation, he was gone. And look at him now. He's getting nothing but the highest of praise as a member of the San Francisco Shock as Krusty's right-hand man. Now, of course, for all I know, Casores might have really wanted to leave the Reign. I have no idea what led him to leaving, but man does it feel like the Reign severely dropped the ball nonetheless. The Boston Uprising. Oh, Boston. There's practically limitless options for you. They've screwed up a number of times throughout the last 3 years. You could easily make an argument over a certain player they traded or released, like Striker, for example, who went on to help the Shock win 2 championships. The one that takes the cake for me personally, though, is the management selection, and their inability to move on from said management. Some of the people who have been hired to take care of the players and make this roster have made some very, very poor choices. I think that goes without saying. All you have to do is look at the different stories out there. Think about Striker, who supposedly tilted more than once during practice, or Blase describing the poor team culture and lack of stability live on a stream and in video. When you have someone openly calling their experience playing for your team trash, with so many other stories as well, it becomes rather hard to defend your team management. In my honest opinion, some of the choices the Boston Uprising made back when the league was entering its inaugural season truly did shape their future into what we see it as in the present. Sure, Season 1 was pretty successful, but there's not much to show besides that currently. Lots of low finishes in tournaments and in the overall standings. Boston has developed an awful reputation. So many of their players have either wanted to be traded or have decided to leave the team mid-season because they just couldn't take being on that team anymore. If Boston can have a decent year in 2021 though, then maybe they can make me eat my words with a 50% success rate. The Chengdu Hunters. I gotta say, most of the mistakes made by the Hunters are more on the minor side. The major mistake that comes to mind, I guess, for me with this team is their roster selection the previous 2 years. More specifically, not getting enough players who are versatile enough to be good outside of wrecking ball compositions. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy watching Chengdu play their crazy strategies. The big problem is that they usually lack consistency. The only time they've ever had this was during the summer when ball comps were actually the meta. The results during GOATs weren't the greatest, and their struggles during the double shield bunker meta were quite apparent. Their over-reliance on these wrecking ball-centered strategies have been a major weakness. When they've tried to force it into something that completely walls what they're trying to play, they have sustained some ugly losses. It might not have been a major difference in the grand scheme of things, but maybe having a more versatile roster could have led to a slightly more enjoyable experience these last 2 years for Chengdu fans who just wanted to see their team succeed and go far. The Dallas Fuel. Kind of like with Boston, it's difficult to go wrong with many of the decisions that Dallas have made over the years. They've done so many things that have made their fans quite upset. I think the biggest one that stands out for me is the hiring of Kai as the head coach back in Season 1. I know that the Dallas team that we saw was not as good as advertised, but he really did not help make the situation any better. It's as if he had no clue how to manage a team at all. Right after opening night, it felt like things continued to get worse and worse and worse until they nearly hit rock bottom. Despite some of the big name players he was working with, he mismanaged pretty much all of them. I understand that main tank was a huge problem given XQC's inability to stay out of trouble, but man, they actually tried to make both Taimu and Mickey on main tank work, and that's just not the right tank situation to have. The fuel had Effect and Rascal on the same team. Two elite DPS players, but Rascal got driven away. Everything was so unorganized and there was no clear direction whatsoever. This team was extremely divided from what I can remember. This especially goes for the comms. They had such an extreme lack of communication in-game that people even wondered how they were an Overwatch League team. And let's not forget about the mismanagement of Seagull. Kai and his coaching team casted him aside and forced him to learn a new role. Meanwhile, you have Taimu who nearly retired and Effect taking a break after trying so hard to carry his team to relevance every single game for 3 whole stages. The fact that Dallas let the fire burn for as long as it did was simply mind-boggling. I guess this is partially the management's fault too though, since they were so hesitant despite their team undergoing a massive implosion. The Florida Mayhem. It's a tie for me with this one between their management choices in seasons 1 and 2. The big problem with season 1 was obviously the tiny player roster plus having very few coaches on board. It caused problems right from the start. How some of the coaches treated the players is also pretty unacceptable, since the players were essentially on their own at times. Back to the management though, think about what they did to Vic. The way they treated him was simply absurd. How on earth are you going to make one of your own players drive the team bus to the Blizzard Arena like every single day? How can you do that? This man has enough stress on his shoulders as it is. It's not fair, and to this day, I still don't understand how they could let something like this happen. It's just such a terrible look. Then in Season 2, the Mayhem decided to hire Bare Hands as their assistant GM and head of scouting, and needless to say, Florida were all over the place. They did not have any sort of identity during Stage 1, and they just kept trying to mix and match players and cultures who simply were not compatible. Now, I definitely do give the team props for making a culture change really quickly right after Stage 1, but it came after lies and poor treatment towards some of their Western players, like McGravy from what I can remember. And supposedly, Bare Hands was the person behind much of this poor treatment and deception. It led to even less respect within this org from the outside looking in. Florida fans were suffering the most they ever had essentially, and it's not like he was doing any favors with his scouting, if you even want to call it that to begin with. Thank goodness they moved on to Albert as the new head of management because he completely saved them. The Guangzhou Charge. I'm going to say their biggest mistake was their coaching decisions during the 2020 playoffs. More specifically, I'm turning towards their lineup they fielded. I was in complete and utter confusion over their decision to keep Eileen on the bench right as Sombra Reaper was starting to gain relevance in the meta. These are two heroes he is very, very strong on, and yet he found himself primarily on the bench. An MVP candidate and the best and most impactful player on the team besides Krong saw minimal playtime in a do-or-die tournament. Oh, and another thing, they really tried to run Rio on Sigma. Even if he's not the best Roadhog, wouldn't you rather have your superstar off-tank who played that character at an MVP level handle it? Their successful season was basically just put to waste. The coaching decision here is hard for me to understand. Was this really the lineup and strategy that they thought worked the best during their scrims? Even if it was, they refused to make any adjustments after getting beaten into the ground. Soul crush you. Then you learn absolutely nothing, get crushed by the NYXL. What a waste of potential. The Guangzhou Spark. Besides a few bumps in the road here and there, they've made a lot of the right calls over these last 2 years, I feel. So the thing I have on them is a bit more minor. In my opinion, their biggest mistake was waiting as long as they did to pick up an off-tank during the 2020 season. Now I know, the pandemic made it a lot tougher to process and sign players, but the fact of the matter remains that Rio was dealing with a wrist injury for months. As a result, they had to rely on Sasin, who was only really effective on Zarya. This forced the Spark to be somewhat one-dimensional with what tanks they could run at a decent level. Now granted, it only took them about 2 months to sign QOQ after they played their first game at the end of March, but still, they could have avoided all of this to begin with if they maybe just got a backup during the offseason. They might have been able to win a few more games during the early season if they were just a bit better equipped. Again, I'm kind of just nitpicking here, but that's kind of what I have to do since the Spark have done a lot of stuff well so far. The Houston Outlaws. I would say one of their biggest mishaps was not taking good enough care of their main tank situation last year. Muma was easily one of the worst main tanks in the league last year, and his play did nothing but hold his team back. Unlike playing Raucus over Repel or Blase and McCree, this was a bit more of a long-term issue, and with every passing game as him as the starter, the optimism that Outlaws fans felt continued to decline. While other members of the Outlaws could have of course played a lot better, Muma was easily the biggest individual problem in most people's eyes. There were just so many poor decisions that he made, especially during the Reinhardt meta. The Outlaws literally did not win a single game until Reinhardt was out of the meta. He had a staggering 7.5 deaths per 10 minutes on Rein, and it's not like his Winston was all that much better, clocking in at 6.5. Needless to say, this man dies a lot. He's a very resource-heavy tank player, which is a style that has proven to not be nearly as effective back during Season 1 when he was actually considered to be one of the better main tanks. Muma did not have a good time, plain and simple. And for a while, Houston were stuck with him because they did not sign any sort of official backup. Sure, they had plans for hydration in the works, but he was technically a flex DPS at the start of the year. But I mean, come on, let's be honest here. Having hydration as your contingency plan is rather questionable. Hydration has proven to be a very flexible player, but you can't expect him to be the answer. Main tank is not his natural position. They really should have put more effort into addressing this position. I can't help but wonder if they could have at least won another game or two if they had a more competent main tank in their starting lineup. The London Spitfire. In recent years, they've made their fair share of mistakes, but I must say, the biggest problem for me is them poorly making adjustments to their roster after winning the Grand Finals. Top of the world or not, they were still very much human after going on that crazy playoff run. It was not all fun for them in Season 1. After Stage 2, they were plagued by inconsistency, and that inconsistency carried over to that first playoff game as well. On paper, they looked good, but to merely bat an eye when they had a chance to bolster their roster costed them big time. Despite Nuss being mediocre for much of Season 1, they started the year off with no other options. And don't even get me started on them failing to get more players who understood GOATs. They failed to adjust to the new meta, which had already been going strong for like half a year at that point. In the end, it probably does not make a major difference when it comes to title aspirations, but surely they could have at least won another game or two to secure a playoff spot without the hassle of the play-ins. Their overconfidence led to their downfall. The LA Gladiators. This one's going to be simple. It's more of a what if, but I'm going with their inability to patch things up with Fissure towards the end of Season 1. I'm not saying it would have made a difference for sure when it comes to their fate, but you do have to admit that he certainly would have helped increase the odds of the Gladiators taking down London during the playoffs, or at the very least put up a better fight. After the first win in that series, the Gladiators basically rolled over and died, but I for one believe Fissure would have helped this team go down fighting if they were still going to lose in that situation. Right from the moment that Fissure got traded there, he became their guy. He was their superstar who pushed his teammates past their limits. He led by example while making big play after big play along the way. But sadly, the Gladiators and Fissure just could not avoid that falling out leading to him getting benched. If only there weren't such major differences between the two sides. If only Fissure was still willing to play for a mixed roster. It's a shame, really. I can't help but wonder what could have happened both in the playoffs and a little bit afterwards if they were all on the same page. The LA Valiant. As a Valiant fan, I can say without a shadow of a doubt, one of the biggest mistakes they have ever made was playing Kuki at main support. No offense to Kuki, he's doing a great job as the coach of Florida now, and he was genuinely a fantastic communicator from what I've been told when he played. But he's in the same situation as Hydration here. Main support is a foreign position to him. He played main tank his entire career up until that point. So even if the communication from him was great, he's going to lack with the mechanics and his overall decision making because he's only had a few months really to prepare and just learn this hero in general. We saw that firsthand whenever he played. He struggled greatly. Meanwhile, the team leader and captain Custa was on the bench for multiple games during Stage 1. That truly does blow my mind. To this day, I still do not understand what Coach Moon was thinking. Custa was literally the most vocal player the Valiant had. As we've seen both before they acquired him during Season 1 and afterwards when he was benched in Season 2, the team lacked a true direction without him providing guidance and calling the shots. I'm not saying they would have avoided going 0-7 or anything like that, but you'd have to imagine they're in a much better position to win one of those close games they almost won by having someone in there who truly knows what he's doing. The Kuki experiment still gives me nightmares to this day. Not only did it cause pain and great shame for the org, but also for the fans. It was a dark time for all Valiant supporters. May we never have to witness something of this magnitude ever again. The NYXL. At first I had a hard time deciding simply because it was very tempting to go with the disaster of a signing that Hotba turned out to be. But then I realized, the reason that Hotba even got signed there to begin with was probably due to a different mistake. I have 3 letters for you all. IMT. The NYXL promoting him to head coach might have been the biggest mistake they've ever made. At the time, it definitely did make sense given how he led the way during the Season 2 playoff run the NYXL had. But looking back at it a year after it happened, it did not age well at all. Given his ideals to make the team more aggressive, I'm sure that's a major reason why he wanted Hoppa. Now granted, Hoppa actually was pretty decent during Season 2, but the problem here is that a lot of Hoppa's value turned out to come when he was flexing on the DPS characters. Some of his biggest strengths could not be shown off in a role lock, unfortunately. As a result, he got exposed as a selfish and overly aggressive off-tank who made the lives of everybody else around him much more difficult. Speaking of aggression, IMT's vision to make this team less passive resulted in a major divide that never got resolved. Half of the team became too resource heavy while poor Mono was left on an island and Animo had to work extra hard just to make sure nobody overstepped their boundaries. Despite having an entire year to try and patch everything up, the problem never got fixed. IMT could not steer the ship in the right direction. That plus some questionable lineup choices such as Who Are You on May over Libero, or Libero on Hitskin made the promotion of IMT a failure. In all honesty, the NYXL weren't awful. They were still a top 7 team with a respectable record. It's just that they played below the typical NYXL standards and expectations. Their regular seasons have usually been filled with dominance and consistency, but neither were really ever present during Season 3. When you're good for multiple years in a row, a lot is going to be expected out of you, but they failed, and IMT is a big person to blame for that. The Paris Eternal. I mean, given how well they did in Season 3, plus their budget issues being completely out of their control during this year thanks to the pandemic, we simply have to look at Season 2. My biggest complaint about the Paris Eternal was how they constructed their team in Season 2. Both from the coaching perspective and with some of their player additions, it kind of felt like they were wasting potential. I had no problem with them wanting to go fully European for the sake of giving all of Europe a team to cheer for. But they really did not make some of the best choices. I'm sure many of you Tier 2 enthusiasts will agree with me when I say that they definitely dropped the ball on some potential pickups. It's on the management for not picking the right coaches or scouts, to be honest, because it all starts with them when it comes to constructing a roster, and they genuinely did not get some of the right people. You pride yourself on GOATs, and yet you got very few people who are actually good at it. Like, come on. Shadowburn and Soon aren't these crazy flexible players. They have things they specialize in. They're meant for DPS. GOATs is a collective effort. If you have multiple weaknesses, you're going to get exposed every single time you go up against any sort of above average team. And that's exactly what we saw out of them results-wise. 14th place in the standings and 2 whole games out of even making the play-ins. They never did better than 3 and 4 in a stage. What could have at least been a respectable year was nothing more than a forgettable one that was mediocre at best. The Philadelphia Fusion. Like with London, I'm going to say a major mistake that Philly made came when they refused to make any sort of major changes heading into Season 2. I get that sometimes not doing much can be for the greater good, but that's only when you're a consistent team. Philly were nowhere near that in Season 1. They made grand finals and qualified for stage playoffs once. They were the 6th seed in the playoffs. They made it, but there was a lot of sweating involved. Back in Season 2, I let my traditional sports roots get the best of me, thinking that everything would be fine like with London. But no, Pro Overwatch is very, very different. The way the game is played is constantly changing. The playstyle, the pacing, the meta, it's not like in Season 1. GOATs was the play. DPS were out of style. It was either play GOATs or get dominated. And truth be told, the roster that Philly rocked was not that great at it. Neptuno and Boombox lost a lot of their Season 1 charm, and they did not have any sort of replacement support line. Sure, they had Elk as a two-way player, but that was it. Think about Carpe as well. He was not the worst Zarya in the league, but he definitely had some clear-cut problems. That team suffered just from wanting to play DPS in their comfort picks. They collectively had a poor mindset together. They didn't really get anybody to fill out the holes either. Not enough new people were thrown into the mix. They desperately needed some fresh mindsets of some motivated young players. As a result, Philly basically had a similar season to their first, but without any playoff success. It's a good thing they took this mistake to heart in Season 3. It's a mistake they have learned and grown from for sure. The San Francisco Shock. Easily one of my greatest challenges in this video. It's hard to pinpoint a lot of mistakes from a team that won back-to-back championships. Then there's Season 1, where they intentionally tanked in order to develop their team into a championship material, as we've seen now in the present. They weren't good in Season 1, but they were okay with that. They got their coach of the future, plus many of the necessary players needed to win that first championship and the second one. For the Shock, we've got to dig a little bit deeper. Rather than a management mistake, I'm going to look at their in-game mistakes. More particularly, that C9 against the Atlanta Reign in the 2019 playoffs. In the long run, this really does not do anything to damage them significantly. It was honestly the wake-up call they needed to play one of the most dominant stretches of Overwatch in history. However, at the time of this major mistake, a lot of Shock fans are going to tell you that it was quite the haunting experience. They were the ones favored to win it all. They were the chosen ones. They didn't spend a year building up their roster just to fail in the playoffs. So at the time, this was pretty embarrassing and heartbreaking for that matter. To drop such a hard-fought and winnable game through such a silly error is something people are always going to laugh at. The face now turned meme that Moth made explains it all. It was such a dumb way to lose a game. Would they have won that final fight if they hadn't C9'd? I have no clue. But they definitely had a great shot. Regardless, it's still a haunting image in the Shock history books that easily could have been avoided. The Seoul Dynasty. Okay, no question it's gotta be when they put Jaehong at main tank. Seoul truly hit rock bottom when they made this move. It's not even close for me. It was incredibly embarrassing. To think they really fell apart that badly. Trust me, I know that Miro was not what he had once been and that Kuki was not any better, but what on earth made the coaches think that Jaehong was the better option there? Were the comms really lacking that much at this position? Was the quality of play from their main tanks that unsatisfactory? I have no clue what went down behind closed doors, but how did things get so bad to the point where you put your starting flex support at main tank? Much like the Valiant and the Fuel, the only thing a decision like this did was make everybody else laugh at them. A once respectable team that was considered to be one of the favorites to win the championship was now a complete and utter joke. The almighty Ryu Jaehong had become a meme. Such an awful decision. Jaehong was not good, but of course he wasn't good. They transitioned him into a completely different role with very, very little practice and preparation, so what did you expect was going to happen? He was the punching bag of the league, all because the coaching did not trust their actual main tank players. How did things get this out of control? It really does amaze me. The Shanghai Dragons. Do I even need to say it? This might be one of the most self-explanatory ones on here. The decision to assemble the team they did in Season 1 will go down as one of the biggest mistakes in the history of professional Overwatch. A winless season, a 40-game losing streak. It is quite literally impossible to do any worse than they did. The coaching they had was unbearably strict. The roster to start the season was not posting any meaningful results either. Then management decides to start mixing and matching Korean and Chinese players together, which honestly might have just made the situation even worse. Basically, every aspect of that team was a disaster. The only thing they had going for them besides a few decent players were the fans. The biggest strength of this team was the number of loyal fans they had. They're really lucky they were so likable. If it weren't for that, plus the 0-40 season, they would have been the most irrelevant team in league history during Season 1 most likely. It seems like nothing more than a distant memory now, but that Season 1 team was still a major mistake. The Toronto Defiant. This is another team where there's clearly more than one right answer. You could easily just go with how they managed their roster in Season 2. Picking up some players with not so great reputations plus deciding to have a mixed roster halfway through the season was absolutely insane. Did you know that they only won 3 games after Stage 1? That's a big yikes. But for me, I'm going with their decision to build a marketable roster in Season 3 rather than one that could sustain long-term success. Trust me, I get it. Having Canadians on your team is very appealing, not to mention the jersey sales you could generate from all of the fan favorites you have. But oh man, was it a horrible decision from the performance standpoint. They got a bunch of average to below average players. They lacked leadership for pretty much all of the year as well. Too many soft-spoken and reserved personalities all on one team. Combine that with a lack of star power and boom, a recipe for another disappointing season. The Vancouver Titans. It's another no-brainer. Don't even have to think about this one. The biggest mistake made by this team was not keeping their players happy, leading to their entire playoff contender core leaving. It's hard to drop the ball harder than how Vancouver did, let's be honest. To drive your team to the point of wanting to leave the org because of the stress and frustration is simply unacceptable. This team literally had the best record in the league in Season 2 and were a grand finalist. While they probably would not have gotten back to the finals in Season 3, they definitely still had a chance to at least be competitive. But instead, the Titans management couldn't get those guys happy. So their entire future got changed just because they couldn't figure it all out. This decision could forever change the Titans for years to come. Who knows how long it could be before they're anywhere near competitive again. The Washington Justice. Okay, this one might be seen as a little controversial given how things were before they went full Korean during Season 3, but I'm going with the construction of their Season 2 roster. This team was literally built with the mindset that GOATs would not last long. I'm pretty sure Wizard Young has even admitted to this. He made the roster thinking that he could play up to the strengths of his DPS, but instead, they became quite arguably the biggest weakness. The Corey Zarya and Otto Brig are something that none of us want to remember. It's really sad too because you guys saw what those boys could do when they were in their comfort zone. They could hang in there with all of the best teams. If only they had built a team in a way where they could have sustained themselves at least a little bit during GOATs, then maybe, just maybe, they would have been in a position to possibly make the play-ins. It wouldn't have needed to be anything pretty either. Just like 2 or 3 wins every stage is all they needed. What a shame. That foolish mindset heading into that season proved to be their downfall. Well, that's all of them. That is one mistake made by every single Overwatch League team. What do you think of my list, and what things would you have changed? Let me know down in the comment section. If you enjoyed today's video, I would appreciate it if you could give it a like and subscribe to the channel if you're new. And as always, thanks so much for watching. I appreciate your support a ton, and until next time, this is ATP, signing out. Peace.